Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you about administrative decision making, and the topic of my talk, The Computer Says No, will become a bit more real in a little while. I'm going to give you a bit of some context around the Australian Crime Commission, who we are, what we do, and what that means. I will preface it though by saying that I've only been in government for 4.5 years, and before I joined government I had particular conceptions about how analytics was done in government and how decisions were made in government, but since joining the public service, I have to say I had absolutely no idea. And so this talk is really some insight into what I discovered in my journey of going, my gosh, this is so much more complicated than I realised, and the implications for people who work in this field of this particular problem that they need to be able to address. Another thing that I'd like to raise is that people often say, you know, IT or analytics is somebody else's problem, not my problem, you know, I just use the systems, whatever. And what this talk hopefully will demonstrate to you is just how much it's actually not somebody else's problem, and it's not just our problem, it's everybody's problem. And it's a problem that we all need to be really engaged in to make sure that we resolve it. And then I'll talk a little bit more about administrative law and what that actually means to automation. So before I get into that, a little bit about our environment and the ACC. So our environment within Australia is that we have several states and territories that have physical boundaries. And we have law enforcement agencies that work within those boundaries, and then we have Commonwealth level agencies such as the ACC, the AFP, Customs, etc., that all work across the whole nation. The Australian Crime Commission's role within that context is that we work to reduce the threat of serious organised crime to the Australian economy and the Australian way of life. What that means is we actually have a very, very broad span of work. We work right from the ground level where we partner with law enforcement agencies on the ground, all the way up to providing strategic insight into what is actually happening, what are the threats to the Australian economy and the Australian way of life, and what should the government actually do about it. So we are the National Criminal Intelligence Agency. We are very strategic, and the threat is what we're all about. We also have the powers of a Royal Commission, so we can collect a broad amount of information. So within the ACC, 4.5 years ago, we established something called the National Criminal Intelligence Capability, Criminal Fusion Capability. And Fusion has been developed, the program ended in the middle of this year. We only had 14.5 million over 4 years, which is nothing really in comparison to what we have achieved. Fusion is multidisciplinary. It has a lot of different agencies that partner in it, and the goal of Fusion was to bring in a lot of information and then maximise the value that we could get from that information through analytics and other methods to ensure that we could actually see what was going on and be in a better position to actually see what the criminal threat was, to equip our analysts to actually do what they needed to do. It also moved us to a new world of information and intelligence sharing, and I'll talk more about that in a little while. So, before I go any further, who in this room has been a victim of crime? Put your hand up. That's a fair bit. It's actually a higher ratio than I've had anywhere else. And of all of the others and you, who of you know someone else who has been, either you've been a victim or you know someone else who's been a victim? That's pretty high. I would say most people should put their hands up, because most of us are actually victims whether we know it or not. We may not actually fall for it, but we are certainly targets. And so every person in this room would have particular expectations about what law enforcement should do about crime. And I would be pretty sure that most people in this room would say that they would prefer not to be a victim, and they would prefer not to have crime enter their lives at all. So they would much prefer that we can actually prevent crime from happening in the first place. But how do you prevent crime? You have to see something coming to be able to address it. You need to be able to harden an environment. But being able to harden an environment to crime and fix fixing the vulnerabilities that exist that make that crime happen, you need to understand what's going on. So that means that you need access to a lot of information. And Fusion was really about this. And so there are a couple of different things that we talked about in Fusion, and we relied on Rumsfeld's definitions. So the first thing was that we didn't actually have a clear idea about our unknown knowns. So the reason for this is because we didn't know, because we didn't share well. And to be frank, we still don't share very well. We define information sharing as giving people access to systems, not systems access to systems. And that's really not going to get us there. The next thing was the known unknowns. We're not very clear on those either. So we don't know what we don't have because we can't get it. And then finally, the unknown unknowns. Crime changes all the time. So we don't know what we don't know. Something could be happening right now and we're completely unaware of it because we've never seen it before. So we need to actually be much better at looking for patterns to see that there's new types of crime. What we've typically found in this agency is if you take down a particular syndicate, another one will pop up in its place if you don't actually fix the vulnerabilities that they were exploiting. So why is the crime there in the first place? What is it that makes people victims? And how do you stop it from happening before it actually happens? And that's really not very easy. So we all know that we live in the information age, and it means we all have access to a lot of information. And it really is a profound economic transformation, as this particular quote tells us. The way we work has changed radically, and the internet has facilitated crime as well as legitimate business. It gives you ease of use, speed, effectiveness. There's a massive profit potential for both legitimate and criminals. It gives you security, and it also gives you anonymity. There are a wide range of transactions that people can actually use on the internet, and it's increasing all the time. Things like hacking, spamming, and denial of service attacks were completely inconceivable a few years ago, and yet now they're just completely commonplace. So what does that mean for us? Well, there are ripple effects. Crime is changing. It's becoming increasingly virtual. Whereas we used to hear about people robbing houses or banks, people don't rob banks anymore in the physical world. They do it electronically. So the internet assists and expedites traditional crime, things like fraud and identity theft, which is getting easier and easier, and money laundering, all getting much easier. But it also creates new types of crime. And mobility is also making it easier and easier for criminals. Unlike us, unfortunately, criminals are unfettered by legislation, morality, and physical boundaries. You can be a victim from someone halfway around the other side of the world. Whereas we are bounded by legislation, morality, and physical boundaries. They have no shareholders, they have no policies, systems, or protective controls. They can stand something out, take it back down, run away. They are increasingly sophisticated, opportunistic, and they are very adaptive and very fast. So the call to us is we need to be adaptive and fast. And we need to leverage our information to the greater extent possible. And that means aiding and assisting complex decision making. So let me start at the beginning. Why do law enforcement agencies share information? They share because if we don't share, then we can't prevent things from happening. Criminals, as I said, are limited by physical boundaries. Information sharing takes away those boundaries. We do it because we want to reduce duplication, we want to join the dots, we want to collect once and use many times. Those are phrases we hear all the time. We want to also improve our collaboration across the nation and ultimately increase the network effect of information. My piece of puzzle with your piece of the puzzle is far greater value than each one of them, the sum of the parts. So we're talking about economics of scale and scope. And this is really where Fusion began. This is why we built the Fusion capability. But the problem is, what happens if we share information? I said a little while ago, we define information sharing by providing people access to systems, but people don't have time to look at every system, to ask every question. They just can't. So Fusion focused on a lot of information collection and sharing, but it had trade-offs because we couldn't just provide all the information to analysts. There had to be something in the middle that actually processed it to assist them with knowing what was actually important to them. And our processes just weren't ready. What we had when we started Fusion were several systems that were far from fit for purpose. In fact, Microsoft Excel was probably the most common tool of choice here. We also were using a data warehouse, and we were cleansing data to get it in. And that was proving to be completely impossible, and I'll show you some examples of why. And we also had issues around sources. You know, what happens if you've got sources and you don't really know whether to trust this source? And what happens if you have conflicting information between different sources? How do you deal with that? It's not easy. And what happened was that we were wasting precious time, not only our time, but we were running the risk of disseminating or disclosing information to partner agencies that was of very little value to them, because we weren't really scratching beneath the surface very much. We just didn't have time. So to give you an understanding of what this actually meant, this is the Australian Criminal Intelligence Model, and this is a model that's been adopted by all of law enforcement across the nation. This tells you the cycle that our analysts work in. And this is what it looked like at the start of Fusion. So I've constrained the bottlenecks. We had manual data scrubbing and a very, very large growing backlog of data to cleanse and get into our warehouse. We had disconnected, manual and inefficient systems. We had a lot of manual processes around reporting and dissemination. And we weren't really evaluating what we were doing. That was very manual, and still today, that is not what it needs to be. And the loop wasn't really a loop. There wasn't a lot of feedback. It was more linear than a loop. So to give you an example of the worst bottleneck there, these are the data ingestion statistics from mid to late 2010. The mustard coloured line shows you the number of tasks finished, so how many data sets were actually loaded it's every month. And then the red line tells you what was in the backlog. So we were collecting more than we actually had the ability to ingest. If you extend that out to today, it's insane. That trend was going off the chart. So that's assuming no additional collection and no changes to the number of staff actually doing the cleansing. So today we would have had 165 data sets waiting. However, we did increase our collection and we reduced our staff. So it would have been much worse than what you see there today. So that was one of the main challenges that faced me when I first started at the ACC. And after about 3 or 4 months of seeing this happen, I called a halt, and we took a massive risk with the business and said we will not be ingesting data for 3 months. That was quite a risk. They were not happy with that, but we had to fix the problem, and we did. A couple of months later, we loaded everything very quickly, and you can see the massive upload and then a gradual increase, to the point where we now have over 1,200 data sets, and it doesn't take very long for us to get the data in. So we have very rapid ingestion. We've reduced the number of people who actually ingest data from 6 full-time people to less than 1. In fact, it's probably about a quarter of an FTE. So it was a 92% increase in efficiency. And there is no bottleneck, so we can get the information in very quickly. And the person responsible for designing this solution is Neil in the back of the room. We also had a whole lot of other efficiencies that we improved across the agency through the Fusion process. One of those was searching across all of our data holdings. That was a 99% improvement because of the time and the blocks that we had in actually doing everything manually. And there are lots of other common analysis tasks that were improved between 75 and 90%. So, Fusion has been a success story for the ACC, and I'll talk a little bit more about where we're going from here in a minute. But that's given you a bit of a context of the environment, who we are, what we do, and one of the struggles that we had. I'm now going to put that on ice and start the next topic, and then I'm going to bring the two of them together at the end. So, anyone who works in the room, who works in government, is bound by administrative law. Administrative law is something that's for us, the public servants, not for politicians. And it has a lot of challenges and risks. And I think there's a lot of people who don't actually understand what it means for them. This is not unique to the ACC. This is across government. So, decisions. If you are a public servant and you make a decision, it must be lawful, unbiased, rational, effective, efficient, open, and fair. You also have to have procedural integrity, and you're held accountable. I can't put my hand on my heart and tell you that every single decision I have made has got all of those characteristics, because I do not have time to check everything all the time. So that's what we do in our normal day. We make a lot of decisions, and we're bound by administrative law, and those are the requirements that are placed on us. Add to that things like security levels and information security processes and procedures that you have to follow. Add to that, within our particular environment, the fact that the ACC cannot disclose information easily. And every organisation would have its own complexities that people work in. So here's a quote from the Administrative Review Council. Did a review of expert systems at the time, 2004, and it says that in view of the potential for cost savings, efficiencies and greater accuracy in decision making, it can be expected that automated computer systems designed to assist administrative decision makers will become increasingly important tools of government. So we've got a scenario where we're saying, can't cope with the information, it's too much, automation is a good thing, let's do that, but hey, there's this administrative law. So when you make a decision, you have to decide, if it's an adverse decision in particular, whether adverse information is credible, relevant and significant to the decision being made. You also have to provide that information, unless it's confidential, which in the ACC's case often is, to the affected party for comment. You need to provide a statement of reasons and be held legally responsible for your decision. And you cannot disavow reliance on a particular piece of information. We are all on the receiving end of government decision making, even if we're government decision makers ourselves. So we all want this. We want those decisions about ourselves and our lives to be like that. There's no doubt about that. But when you actually make these decisions yourself, how easy is it to make sure you cover off on all of that? So it's hard enough to do it manually, but what about if you automate it? Automation has risks. How do we design new capabilities? There are challenges like I've just gone through, but there's massive opportunities. We've got so much information, we can't deal with the volume. Crime is becoming increasingly sophisticated. We have no choice. But how do we do it? So we're drowning. So how do we build effective systems? Well, for those of you who don't know, some of you in the room won't know, there's a difference between precision and recall. Precision basically means that if I'm going to find particular things like risks or crime, indicators of crime, then what I get is all correct, but I don't get them all. That's sacrificing recall for precision, to say, I make sure that every time I say that that's crime, it's crime. Even if I miss some, that's okay, it's crime. On the other side of it, you've got, no, I actually want to make sure I find all crime, even if there's things in there that are not. And those two things have to be balanced against each other. And what we're talking about is precision versus recall. If I find one type of crime, or one example of crime, and there are 1 million, I have 100% precision, but our recall is way down. But if I find 10 million types of crime, and all of the million are in there, then my recall is 100%, because I've got them all. But it doesn't help people very much. And those two things have to basically go in balance with each other. How do you maximize the two of them? So you can't necessarily maximize precision and go, well, it doesn't matter, we found one, that's okay, that's enough, if actually you've missed the vast majority of what's actually going on. So I don't have to really convince some of the people in the room that recall is actually just as much and just as important as precision. So administrative decision making can be difficult, confusing, and incredibly stressful if you're aware of it. I'm not sure everybody is. And we have to also acknowledge that public servants are human, right? They're making decisions, and it's difficult in this environment. So to give you a flavour of some of the questions that we like to ask, that we may want to automate or semi-automate. Things like, what is unlawful behaviour? How can you see it? What should we know so that we can actually see unlawful behaviour? And what about if you've never seen it before? I said before, criminals adapt all the time. You take something down, something else. It's like that game where you hit the heads popping up. Right? Hit one, another one pops up. If you've never seen it before, how do you know that it's actually crime? There's not enough information sharing right now. And volume is required to actually see and understand the risks. But volume needs machines. And when you apply machines to that problem, you will not get it right every time. You just won't. Another question. Who or what is an emerging risk? So what's actually coming up that is just a little bit below the surface that we can't see? We need to be able to ask where the risks are. There are lots of different pieces of the puzzle, and they're scattered across lots of different agencies and not necessarily in agencies. One small piece of information can be the key to actually seeing that something is an emerging risk. A lot of the data we deal with is textual, and that's hard enough. And then risks change. So we need longitudinal data to be able to see that things are actually changing over time. And if you automate this, you won't get it right every time. You just won't. Another question. Where are the vulnerabilities? I said before, if we can prevent crime by identifying why crime exists in the first place, why are the elderly vulnerable to this particular type of crime? How do we fix that? Is it an education problem? What is it? How do we do that? Another question outside of the criminal space. Who should receive treatment in hospitals? How do you prioritise that? That's not an easy question to ask and answer. Because really what you're saying is what matters most, and nobody wants to feel like they don't matter. So that's not an easy one either. And if you automate it, you will not get it right every time. Another question we like to ask. How well are we performing, we being law enforcement broadly? Which policy is working and which policy is not? Can we see that? How well are we doing? Measuring performance in law enforcement is complicated by the fact that you have, in every state, multiple law enforcement agencies, and then at the Commonwealth level, multiple law enforcement agencies, and then at the international level, multiple law enforcement agencies. So it's not easy. And then, to complicate this, to be able to actually measure performance, you need to be able to measure the size of a problem. Because a problem exists, you say it's this big, you do stuff, and then you say it's this big, and then you can say, did that actually make a difference, or was it something else? And that's not easy either, to actually demonstrate that what we did was what fixed the problem. Or if the problem gets worse, would it have been even worse if we'd done nothing? It's hard to tell. And we don't always define what success looks like. So when something like credit card skimming, for example, suddenly becomes a massive problem and there's a big outcry about it, law enforcement will gather together, form a task force, bring down the risk. Guarantee you it won't be 0, but it'll be down to an acceptable level. What's acceptable? Hard to tell. Not being in the media? There's no real answer to that. And if you automate it, you won't get it right every time. Then to complicate things further, these are 3 things we all want. We want the public to trust the government to make the right decisions. But we also need to value their privacy. And we also need to make sure that we have secure systems and also that we provide safety for our people, for our citizens, make them feel safe. Finding the middle where we balance all of those 3 is not easy. And there's a role for analytics right there on the tightrope, finding the balance between automation and procedural fairness. And this is the problem that I think is going to face us. If we don't face this head on, we will be in a whole world of hurt. This line is incredibly difficult to walk. Our job in my branch is to make it possible and to make it easier for our people to do their work, our analysts to do their work, but we have to balance the legal and the legislative and the lawful constraints that we have. So that's what this is all about. If those of you who have not seen Little Britain, I recommend you go and Google Carol Beer, Little Britain. Little Britain is a television program that has a couple of people who do all these skits, and this would have to be my favourite character because it's a man dressed up as a woman, and no matter what the scenario is, she can be a doctor's assistant, she can be in a travel agency, anything like that. No matter what situation, when someone says they want to do something, her answer is always, computer says no. No discretion. No customer service. What the computer says stands. That's it. End of story. This is not what we want. Because if our people become too reliant on machines, they will stop using their discretion. As administrative decision makers, if I walk up to someone in this room and say, I heard you're making a decision about this, and I think you need to make this decision over here, maybe because it's better for me, you can ask me why. Well, why do you think that? Tell me more. But if a machine says to you, that's a risk. 10, 15, 20 years ago, if it was a rule-based system, you could actually say, how did you get to that conclusion? Today, with statistical systems, no, cannot do it. With the volume of information that we're actually using, it's just not possible. Just not possible to do everything with rules. So, when decision makers start to fear making decisions that are contrary to what a computer is telling them, we are in trouble. Because they will go, well, the computer's told me that, and I can't ask it why, so if I do something different, will I get into trouble, or should I just do that and blame the machine? And that's not easy. So, the other thing, of course, which I mentioned before, is if you rely on the recommendations of a system, you cannot disavow the fact that you've relied on that information. The system can't explain its reasoning. It can't tell you whether the information it used was credible, relevant, or significant to the decision being made. And we're asked to do that. So what if people start relying less on their own judgment? So how do we fix this problem? Well, that's where everyone in this room comes into it. We have to work together on this problem. This problem is not going to go away. We have to have experts who are experts in understanding how to identify what matters inside information. We need smarter systems that walk that balance, and those systems must be able to work with uncertainty. They have to be able to deal with uncertainty and give that uncertainty to the user to say, this is a crime of this percentage certainty, so that the user can then use their own discretion. Things like uncertainty chains will become increasingly important. In our world, when we deal with textual information, there are multiple steps to extract the information from text. It's then joined with structured data, more steps, And every single step has an error rate. How do you multiply all of that to get your answer in the end? It is not easy. Question answering will become increasingly important. So being able to actually ask a machine, this is my question, not my query, to find me lots of information, tell me the answer. That will become increasingly important. What if that answer is incorrect? How are we going to deal with that? Precision is not everything. So we can't just say, we'll give you one answer and then we'll stop and not tell you anything further. It won't work. So we need to be able to support effective decision making, and we need to be able to bring the data to the analyst, not the other way around. And we need to be able to prevent privacy failures, and that's not easy either. There's a few pieces of legislation that actually have in them that a decision made by a computer is deemed to be a decision made by the secretary, or in some cases, other cases, the minister. So it's a journey, and there's a few things that I think will help us if we can do it this way. The first thing we need to do is we need to be very, very adaptable. And we, being the people who develop the systems, as well as our people who we develop it for, they likewise need to be very adaptable and experimental. We went through a bit of this culture change in this agency with the fusion capability, and a lot of our people who are analysts are quite adaptive, quite flexible in their thinking. The information environment is becoming incredibly complex, so we need to be able to deal with that complexity. The way that we're going to be dealing with it is to develop risk models that adapt to new information and bring in the error and educate our users about what that actually means. The next thing we need to do better is embracing the strengths and weaknesses of our people and our partners. Both sides. We all have strengths and weaknesses, and in a couple of slides I'll be talking about analytics and engineering. We all have strengths and weaknesses, but if we can acknowledge those, and the same with our systems, acknowledge where they're strong and where they're weak, and what kind of oversight is required to actually make sure that they do what they're there to do, but do not introduce new risks. That's what this is about. Analysts are amazingly smart. When we started the fusion capability, one of the things that we focused on was providing them with better tools and better information more rapidly. But it's incredible how people will take something like that and leapfrog and do things that you didn't expect them to do. We need to continue to do that, and I'll talk about our national focus in a little while, particularly on the national stage. We need to do more of this. And what this does is it gives people breathing space to innovate rather than wasting enormous amounts of time dealing with the volume of information. The other thing that we did within Fusion that was, I think, particularly good was we did tradecraft improvement hand in hand with analytics. So this is about looking at what analysts already do and improving it through analytics, and then changing the way that they do their work to get those efficiencies. I mentioned I would talk a little bit about this. This is one of my favourite things. I consider myself to be both a scientist and an engineer. Some people do. Some people will go firmly, no, I'm a scientist, and other people will say firmly, I'm an engineer. They are quite different schools of thought. And it's very important to bring these people together, and I've got a few of them in the room, mine in the room. You wouldn't have heard this yet. Analytics, in my view, is the science of analysis. So it's actually about looking at how analysis occurs, how people do that job, and improving it. So science is about improvement. It's about looking at what is, and then finding out what could be, what is possible, reaching for the stars. Scientists will question what is, to think about what is possible. They can be either top-down, so they can start with a question and say, how do I answer this question? Or they can be bottom-up and start with the information and say, what bubbles to the surface? What can I actually see? And you need people who can actually do both. In a top-down approach, you're very people-focused. You start with, who are the people out there? What types of questions do you have? One of the first things I did when I joined the ACC was I sent out an email to our analysts saying, if you had a big red button on your desk that you could push to automate one thing, what would it be? And I got a whole range of answers, but there was some consistency in those answers. And we used that as the way to say, right, these are the first cab off the rank, is this one, because this is where everyone's wasting their time. And that was a top-down approach. But we're also starting, and we've been doing some bottom-up risk analytics to see what is actually in the data. Scientists also like to create new processes, solve problems, and then move on to the next one. They don't want to go back and repeat the same thing. There's a big risk in government analytics in that this happens a lot, but then those people leave and you don't retain that knowledge and you haven't actually made it available to everyone in the organisation. Scientists are very, very comfortable with failure. They don't mind failure at all. They will fail many times. They'll probably fail more times than they are successful, and they are completely comfortable with that. They just move on. But engineers, they like to build stable, repeatable processes. Failure is not an option for an engineer. When a bridge falls down, it's a tragedy. They are very, very good at turning experiments into reality. They're very good at making experiments repeatable. So these two camps should work together because they're the flip side of the same coin. And when they work together well, the scientists can do a lot of experiments and find new ways of doing things, and the engineers can come behind with those successes and automate them and make them standard practice. Analytics specialists are also very good at teaching. They're very good at teaching analysts about considering repeatability. One of the other things we found with Fusion was we would go around and talk to analysts about what they did, and they were all different. Tradecraft was non-existent, really. And what we did was we captured some of that thinking and then automated it to see, can we roll that out a bit more. And so analytics specialists are very good at this. So that's that whole organisational tradecraft improvement. So where are we going? Fusion changed a lot of things that people in this organisation and outside of this organisation took for granted, but there is more that's on the way. I believe that the biggest risk that we've got, second to the computer says no risk, is the fact that we have the information, but we just can't find it. There will be a 9/11 type event, and whereas 9/11 said, the Commission said, you didn't share enough, you weren't imaginative enough, if we have the information, but we can't actually put the dots together, that is on our heads. And that's not going to be easy to deal with. So what we have to do is we have to find those needles, but a lot of that is about removing the haystack rather than necessarily finding the needles. How do we do that? How do we balance it? These are some of the things that we're looking at the moment, and these are the things that we have done from my previous one. We have much more rapid ingestion and linking of our structured data sources. We've started to do text analytics and started to integrate that with our structured sources, but it's very early in the journey for us. We're also much better in phase 3 and then analyse and produce. We've got better connected systems. We've got more efficient systems. We've got a platform that all our analysts use, and we are using advanced analytics now to automate and find new ways of doing that task. In phase 4, the report and disseminations, we've got new ways of getting the information out, much more streamlined processes, improved templates, and we've also started to do alerting of our partners in an automated way. What we're doing next, in phase 2, we're going to be getting more data. We're going to focus on the criminal intelligence picture at the national level, and I'll talk about that next. We will do more text analytics, we already are. In phase 3, we will increase the connectivity of input sources. We will increase our efficiency in several ways. We will automate risk assessment even more, and this is something that will go on and on with more information. And obviously we'll be using increased analytics. Step number 4, we have already got some automated alerting, both inside and outside of the organisation. We want to do more of that. We want to be able to push information to consumers. But the tricky thing there is making sure that we don't overwhelm them. So we've got to be able to work out what is the most important information for this individual. And we will also increase our connectivity for output to get that information out more quickly. And then we're starting to tackle number 5, and this is particularly important. We need to be better at measuring the impact that we are having. We need to be much better at deciphering what is the value of the information that we've got so that we can prioritise what we collect. And that means we need to know who it's valuable for. We've got to have a much better understanding of the community and what they are doing. And then finally, we're going to close the loop. We're going to actually start to use what we've done to plan and prioritise and direct, rather than starting from scratch. So the National Criminal Intelligence System we will be developing will be a part of this, a big part of this. The goal of NCIS, not NCIS, is to enable free flow of information across jurisdictional boundaries. We have within our legislation the need to provide a national criminal intelligence database. We call it ACID. This system will replace that. And so we need to do it, but we're going to be far more proactive in the way that we do it. That means we're going to start pushing information out rather than just having it there in a static way. That requires a culture of connectivity across all of law enforcement and collaboration. It means everybody actually needs to start working together rather than keeping their data close. This will involve providing similar tools to what we provided in Fusion, things like collaboration tools, data and text analytics, proactive monitoring and alerting, as I've mentioned. We will also integrate Fusion with this, and we will also take a whole of government approach to shared services. When we create new components, new analytics components, things like text analytics, why can't we make those web services that others can use? There are also 2 particular components that will sit inside NCIS that are part of the National Criminal Intelligence Model, and that is a National Request for Information Service across law enforcement and a National Product Directory, so we need to do those. Ultimately, what this is about is improved decision making across law enforcement, very broadly. But all of those issues that I've mentioned will all be issues in the development of NCIS. As part of NCIS, we'll also be looking at the interaction between the Australian Criminal Intelligence Model and the policy cycle. This agency is a little bit unique in that we do right on the ground work all the way up to providing strategic insight to high-level decision makers. Those 2 cycles go together. The intelligence cycle basically creates an evidence base. You bring together a whole lot of information, you do stuff across that information to measure the size of a problem, and then you make recommendations about how to address it. Policy is not that different, but it's taking that broader strategic view. These 2 cycles go hand in hand, and if we want to be able to actually measure whether policies are effective, companioning it with the ASIM is what's going to make that happen. So the reason why we're doing this is because we want to get better at identifying trends. Things like credit card swiping is going up. It's beyond what we consider to be acceptable, so that we can actually start to have indicators and warnings. We also want to be able to measure the effectiveness of law enforcement, and this is going to assist. We want to be able to measure the effectiveness of policy. If you look around the country and you look at every state, it has its own policies about how to deal with particular things. Things like synthetic drugs. If one state says we're going to ban them and another state says actually we're not, we're going to take this other policy, we can start to say, well, we can see how those policies are working or not. And that's something that we want to be able to do. So that is enhanced decision making at the highest levels. But again, if we get it wrong, then what? Because this is not human alone. This is about a symbiotic relationship between a machine and a human. And the final thing that we need to do better is improving our partnerships. This means that we need to work much more with industry to develop systems that don't exist by working together as partners rather than just a supplier, a vendor and a consumer. We've also established relationships with academia that we didn't have previously. And every person in this room who has an interest in analytics can assist this. Continual information processing, to be able to look at how things are changing and looking for the risks and looking for where things are important, takes time and it takes expertise. We need to be better at identifying what is relevant and what is important, because otherwise we'll just all be snowed under. That's it. Any questions?
I'm sure there are questions. I thought it certainly found a very thought-provoking and interesting presentation. I reckon if we can do 4 or 5 questions before we break up, that would be great.
Yeah. Do you want me to pick or you can pick? Yeah, okay.
In developing, or particularly with automated systems, is the scope for cooperating with other agencies in other countries? Presumably there are some problems with that. But,
Yes, there is. Absolutely, there is. So we are actually increasing our international presence, and that's one of the reasons we see that crime has no boundaries, no physical boundaries. So we need to be much more mindful about that. And some of our international partners have solved problems that we haven't, and likewise, we can help them with problems that we've got. But yes, absolutely. Yep.
In terms of attributes that you'd like your people to have, is it? Do you favour? Do you weight more highly knowledge of, let's say various languages or techniques or that sort of thing, or at a slightly different level, the ability to learn new techniques?
The number one thing that I value in my people is actually making a difference to the business.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
The number one thing that I value in my people is the ability to make a difference in the business.
Yes.
So, someone can have all the knowledge in the world or learn very well, but unless they actually produce outcomes in the business, it's not all that useful. I think I certainly value people who are very adaptable, who can pick up new techniques. I think given the rate of technology change, we have to be like that. We can't afford to be rigid in our thinking. We have to be able to pick up new things and challenge what's normal. Certainly in Fusion, that was the experience that we had. We needed people who could actually think outside the square.
So variant of that question, what ratio would you have engineers and scientists?
Ooh, that's a very good question. Maybe a 50-50. But what I really like is people who can do both. There are not that many people who can, but there are people who can do both. And it is a different mindset, but I think most engineers are capable of doing it. Most people who come through university, all the academic computer science lecturers are researchers and scientists, but they all started out as engineers. So most of them. So, it is possible. It's just a different way of thinking. So I think, that whole concept of teach them. So you can have people who come into this organisation who didn't start as engineers and they're analytics specialists. They need to understand how how engineers think, because otherwise they won't see the value that they provide. And likewise, engineers really need to understand that these very experimental, agile, rapid innovators are great for actually coming up with new ways of thinking. So I think that they go really hand in hand. I think a 50-50. Yeah.
When you were talking about precision and recall, you were talking about it's a world of hurt if you get it wrong. What can you mean there, or what is the balance like for your analysts on the ground?
Mostly, I think, and this is we're still at the beginning of this journey as well. Mostly, I think it's about educating them to actually understand that, you know, you take all these pieces of input and you make the decision. It's actually not the machine making the decision. You make the decision. Therefore, you must be accountable, etc. All those things. But we have a responsibility to make sure that when advice is given, they're given the context and they can go digging behind it to see how does this come about and what other information and how can I look at this in different ways. And that's an education process, and it's something that we've contained within the organisation because Fusion was an inward-looking tool, whereas with NSYS it's outward-looking. So if we're sending out information, information I think is fine. If we can say, look, we think this is important, well, we haven't sent you what we don't think is important, but it doesn't necessarily matter as much. But if we send out something saying that person is committing a crime and they're not, that's a much higher risk, much higher. So how do we, as an agency, protect ourselves when we've got partners who we don't necessarily know with individuals? You know, a person pulls someone over on the side of the street in Queensland, you know, in their car, looks them up, nothing in Queensland systems, looks them up in the national system and says, yes, this is a match. What if that's wrong, right? So how do you equip that person on the street to actually make the best decision at that point in time? We can't afford not to do it, but we can't afford to not do it well. It's that balance. David?
Maria, you were talking about how the alerting systems are improving and how the data holdings are getting larger and being ingested, you know, lump by lump. What's the time frame for real-time ingestion and real-time alerting?
It's a very good point. Real-time ingestion is going to depend very much on relationships and making sure we can actually bring those feeds in. Real-time alerting, we're nearly there. We've got semi-real-time alerting. We now have the ability for information to enter and exit the organisation within minutes without a human hand touching it. So we're much closer to that, but we still have more to do. Yeah, there's more. Yeah.
How much data are you talking about?
In which? In Fusion?
Yeah.
So Fusion. Oh, I don't know. Neil, can you say how much data?
How much data?
How many terabytes of data have we got?
We've got quarter of a billion records.
And with the text, is it structured text or just random strings?
Well, most of the text that we deal with is information reports from our partner agencies. So it's typically well-structured text, but there are other types of text that we use that are not so well-structured.
So maybe in one or two sentences, what's the technology behind this, the ingestion and all that?
So we could give a whole talk on that.
Put that down for next
That will
year.
be a topic for next year.
Yeah.
I'll talk to you later.
Any other questions?
I was going to comment. Precision and recall, I mean, it's entirely parallel to the sensitivity and specificity language that's used in clinical medicine. It's of course an issue across a whole variety of areas. And,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's right. And it's not a new concept. It's in information retrieval. It's been around for a while.
And you just have to. Well, I mean, one way to pretend it is to decide relative costs that presumably you do.
Yes. Yes, you do. And mostly people just go 50-50, just balance the two, keep them completely in balance. But depending on the task, you can weight one way or the other way.
But what you said earlier would suggest that you have to set a greater risk on falsely accusing someone. Yes.
That's right. Or being able to say, what is the certainty behind it, rather than just saying, it's a positive. It's a positive with this certainty. Mm-hmm. Yep.
Do you tend to have more success with hiring data scientists and teaching the trade craft specific to ACC, or do you also sometimes have success taking analysts who know the trade craft and teaching them data science?
Actually, the only people I've hired so far have either been both, they do both, or they've been engineers and we've trained them. Is that right? I think so. I don't think we've hired anyone who hasn't either been an engineer and then moved that way, or has been both an analytics specialist and an engineer and then maintained both. I think we've pretty much got both.
Let's have 2 more questions and then we'll open
Did
it
you
up.
have a question?
I do.
Yep.
Just given the unknown unknowns, is it difficult to choose what not to ingest rather than what to ingest?
Well, it's an excellent question. The answer is yes, it's very difficult. And given that we can't just go, oh, we'll just consume everything that's out there, because that's a complete waste of our time. There's a lot of thought that goes into what should we actually get. And that's hard to do before you've actually seen the results. So there's no clear answer to that question. It's a hard problem. Yeah. There was another one somewhere.
Last question.
Well, one quick, just to make this business about engineers and scientists a bit more precise, when you're talking about automated systems, that's the kind of thing that engineers do.
Yes.
Yes, which really requires a pretty high level of understanding of the kind of thing that scientists do, I guess.
Yes.
One more question from over here.
Well, it's not really a question. It's more a feeling I have. I've worked in the tax office, and I've been working in the space of argumentation theory, and it strikes me what you're talking about. There's a scope for the involvement of that kind of thinking, whereby your decision making is broken down into a structure, which then can be supported or made more consistent at any particular point.
Right.
And it all flows to one final decision.
Right.
And that decision then can be traced back to
Right.
atomic levels.
Right. So you get evidence at each point. In
Correct.
There. Okay.
That's right.
That's an interesting. Yeah. Interesting
Yeah.
concept. You need to talk to Neil.
I shall.
All right, I think that's probably about it for questions. Please stay behind. Maria, if you stay behind as well and chat with people, because there'll be people who want to continue the conversation. I wanted to thank Tipco, my employer, for the nibblies and drinks at the back there. Please finish them, because otherwise it's not good for my health. And we'll see you all at the next meetup in February.